Hello and welcome to Centrify's Customer Success webinar, where we will be talking about SAML applications and answering some commonly asked questions about SAML applications. Today we have Nick Micah from our support team, along with Terry Fogg from our engineering team to answer your questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A window. If we run out of time, please post your questions in the community thread on your invite, and one of our experts will answer your questions there. Now, let's start with some of our frequently asked questions. What is SAML?
SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. It is a single sign-on protocol for exchanging authentication and authorization data between an identity provider and a service provider. Centrify is an identity provider, and a service provider is an application that an end user wants to single sign on to. Now, through SAML, an identity provider and a service provider establish trust between each other by using signing certificates and other settings such as encryption. Once the trust has been established, SAML assertion will be used as a secured message for single sign-on. And after that, a user's password will no longer be involved in the sign-on process. That achieves stronger security.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. Let's move on to our next question. What are the benefits of SAML versus traditional username and password applications?
SAML provides single sign-on with a single account from Active Directory or some other directory service. This simplifies both the user and the administrator experience. For users, it allows them to use a single password and have access to all SAML applications. For administrators, it's much easier to keep track of who has access to what applications, because when you disable a user's directory account, they automatically lose access to all of their SAML applications. In a typical username and password setup, the end user may have multiple usernames and passwords, and eventually these may be written down on a sticky note or in a notebook in their top drawer. For admins, they will have to remember who has access to what and disable accounts one by one. So it really simplifies the user experience and both the admin experience, as well as making things more secure.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And everybody, if you have any questions, please feel free to post it in the Q&A section. Moving on to the next question. What is SAML assertion?
So a SAML assertion is essentially a package of information that supplies authentication, attribute, and authorization statements made by SAML identity providers such as Centrify. In a nutshell, it proves who the user is and where they're coming from.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. What is SAML metadata?
SAML metadata is an XML file that contains SAML configuration. It is used for exchanging configuration information during the process of establishing a trust between an identity provider and a service provider. Now, note that the use of SAML metadata is entirely optional. Many service providers decide to use it. The others decide not to. For the SAML application template in Centrify's app catalog, an identity provider metadata will be provided per application instance. If you see a SAML application in Centrify's app catalog that does not come with an identity provider metadata, that is because the specific service provider does not make use of SAML metadata. We found out during SAML integration that they don't use it. That's why they are not included.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. Now moving on to our next question. Where do I start if a SAML application is not in the catalog?
So first off, you want to check with the service provider to see if they even support SAML. If they do, you can use the custom SAML application template to integrate the service provider. Otherwise, we have some other custom single sign-on solutions available, such as username and password, Centrify browser extension, and TLM, and a few others.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. Now, the next question is, what do you need from the customer and a SAML service provider?
So typically, service providers will have some form of a SAML configuration guide. You also want to check with the service provider to see if they can provide any SP metadata. Some do, some don't. It varies by the vendor. After you have this information, you can use the custom SAML application template to integrate to the service provider. If you need assistance, you can pass that information on to Centrify support.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nick. The next question is, what's the difference between IDP-initiated and SP-initiated single sign-on?
Before I answer that question, let me elaborate a little on the IDP and SP. IDP stands for Identity Provider. SP stands for Service Provider. Now, for IDP-initiated single sign-on, it is where a user logs into IDP's user portal and then being directed to a service provider's application. And then for SP-initiated single sign-on, it is where a user first attempts to access service provider's application. Now, with SAML configured and the trust being established already, the service provider application will redirect the user to IDP's user portal for authentication. After the user is authenticated, IDP will then redirect the user back to the application and logged into it. Now, you can imagine that the second half of the workflow in the SP-initiated single sign-on that I just described is very much like IDP-initiated single sign-on.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. What SAML 2.2 bindings do Centrify support?
For service provider redirecting a user to Centrify, Centrify currently supports HTTP posts and HTTP GET binding. Artifacts and other bindings are not currently supported. Now, to the other direction, from Centrify to a service provider, Centrify use only HTTP posts to send a SAML assertion.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. Now, the next question is, what attributes can I send in a SAML assertion?
You can pretty much send any SAML attributes in a SAML assertion. SAML attributes are configured in the Advanced Script tab of a SAML application. Use the set attribute or set attributes array method to set the attribute names and the value. Now, for the actual syntax, please refer to our documentation that is titled Writing a Custom SAML Script. It will give you more details on the methods that I just mentioned and the values to be used as parameters.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. The next question is that for digital signature, does Centrify sign response or assertion?
So Centrify is capable of signing either one. By default, we sign the response. If a service provider requires an assertion to be signed, you can configure a SAML application to do so in the Advanced Script tab. Change the set signature type value from response to assertion. For the actual syntax, please refer to our documentation titled Writing a Custom SAML Script. Lastly, note that all SAML applications in App Catalog already come with the correctness signature type, so you normally do not have to change the type unless you are using the custom SAML application template.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And now, participants, do you have any questions you'd like to ask about a specific SAML application that you'd like to discuss, anything about settings, or any further information you'd like about SAML applications? I'm going to give a minute for you to, answer any questions or type in any questions. Okay. Looks like we have a question from Victoria. What are the most common existing SAML applications used from your catalog? Nick or Terry, who's going to take this question?
I can go ahead and take that one. So
Perfect.
The most common existing SAML applications, of course, we have Salesforce, SAMmanage, Office 365, and I think those are the major three that we see people use from time to time. We have quite a few in there. Is there any specific ones that you're wondering about, Victoria?
I can add a little more to that also. In our app catalog, there's a category called featured. So that will list out some of the most used SAML applications that customers have used. which include some of them that Nick just mentioned. So if you go into that, you'll see Amazon Web Services as well, Box, Concur, DocuSign, NetSuite, WebEx, and Zendesk, just for a few examples, on top of the ones that Nick has already given.
Perfect. Nick, could you
manage? Sorry, you had a follow-up question there.
Great. So, do you have any other questions, participants? Victoria, do you have any follow-up questions? Great. Thank you, Victoria. I'm going to go ahead and give a few more minutes for any other questions that the participants may have. Okay, looks like Zishan's asked a question. Is there any book that you want to refer regarding SAML?
I can speak a little about that. We do not have a particular book that we will refer regarding SAML. The SAML is a open standard, so you can actually search for it on the internet and you will find a lot of information. Now for this standard, part of it is kind of loosely defined. And what I mean by that is actually it's defined clearly, but then a lot of things are truly up to the service provider and identity provider how they want to implement it. In particular, now for some statements, they would say that a service provider or an identity provider must do certain things, or they shall do certain things. Then those, for those, then we must do it or and shall do it. But there are many others that the specifications only say a service provider or an identity provider should do certain things. Now that opens up a gray area where it is totally up to the business and companies how they want to implement it. And that gives a challenge to a SAML integration, because between identity provider and service provider, they really have to talk to each other about the specific settings and values that the other party use in order to integrate properly. Any one thing that is off could throw off the whole SAML integration. So that's what I mean by, the challenge in the SAML integration.
Great, thank you so much, Terry.
You're welcome.
Zishan, does that answer your question? Perfect. Do any of the other participants have any questions you'd like to ask? Okay, while we're waiting, I'd also like for you to know that our CTO, Paul Moore, has a Chalk Talk video on Centrify's YouTube channel for an introduction to SAML. We'll post the link here, and don't forget to check that out. And okay, looks like that brings us to the end of today's SAML applications customers. Oh, looks like we have another question. The question is, what would you say is the most commonly made mistake in configuring a SAML application? Nick or Terry, who'd want to take this one?
I'll go ahead and I'll take this one. So the
Perfect.
most commonly made mistake in configuring SAML applications, I think the challenges in configuring SAML come from figuring out what the service provider requires, because not all service providers are the same. They all require different attributes in different settings. For example, some service providers require the name ID, the format of the username to be sent over in a specific format, such as UPN or mail or SAM account name, something like that. So when I see people configuring generic SAML applications, custom SAML applications, the most common mistake is simply missing one of those required attributes or misconfiguring one of those attributes. So we always try to work with the service provider as much as possible to figure out exactly what they need and then configure our SAML script to match that.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Looks like our community manager, Anton, has posted the link to the video on our chat window, and I'm going to give it a few more minutes for everybody else to answer to ask any questions. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and end today's session. So if you have any questions, this is your chance to type them in. Yep, there you go. Can you change the authentication attributes, like change from UPN to SAM account name?
Yeah, we can change the authentication attributes from UPN to SAM account name. It's called the name ID format, and you change it within the advanced script of the SAML application. Now, whether or not the service provider will accept what you're sending is a different story, but whatever they accept, we can send.
Thank you, Nick. Zishan, does that answer your question? Okay. Nick, do we need to change any libraries?
Not to my knowledge. Terry, do you know of any need to change libraries? I'm assuming you're meaning a custom on-premise application, Zishan?
Not that I know of. As long as the service provider or your application is SAML 2.0 ready and is able to give out the assertion consumer service URL, define a service provider entity ID, and taking in a signing certificate. So those are the basics of SAML configuration. Then, yeah, there's nothing, and basically it's nothing special about using any other libraries.
Great, thank you so much, Terry. Zishan, does that answer your question, or do you have any follow-on questions? Okay, looks like we have a follow-up question from Zishan. So on-premise, where is the authentication process happening?
Let me talk about IDP, the single sign-on first. By the way, when you mention libraries, do you mean implementing an on-premise application to become a service provider? I see. There are some existing single sign-on solution out there, such as Shibboleth and simple SAML PHP, which is a PHP add-on applications that you could use to make an on-premise application to become a service provider. Now, that is if you are actually the developer of the application, right? So you can add things to it. But for other applications from a vendor, then it really depends on if they actually offer that solution already. If they do not, well, and since it is an on-premise application, you could still put development effort and use those libraries to implement the applications to become a service provider. So I guess that would be more the answer to your previous questions. But now, to answer your second question, so for on-premise, where is the authentication process happen? So this goes back to the IDP initiated single sign-on and the service provider initiated single sign-on we talked about. So it depends on how it is implemented in the on-premise application. If it accepts IDP initiated single sign-on, then the authentication process will start from IDP's user portal. With Centrify, there will be Centrify user portal that the user clicks on an application tile in user portal, then if the user will be redirected to your on-premise application. For SP-initiated single sign-on, if your application implements that, then when a user first go to your on-premise application trying to do anything, and authentication has to happen, right? Now your application will redirect to IDP for authentication. So the user will again see the IDP's user portal, log in there, and then the user portal will programmatically launch the single sign-on from within the user portal and going back to your on-premise solution. So those are the two places, SP or IDP, where the authentication process could happen. Now, for which one the application or the service provider actually supports, that is up to the service provider. Does that answer your question?
Great, thank you, Zishan. Looks like we have another 4 minutes left. So participants, do you have any last questions you'd like to discuss with Nick or Terry before we sign off this chat? Okay then. So thank you everybody for participating. If you have any further questions on this topic, please post it on our community and one of our experts will give you the answer there. And Nick and Terry, thank you so much for today's session. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you very much, you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.